Good evening, everybody. Literature and translations share close connections, as you all know. Translation gives the opportunity to learn about each other and learn from each other. In a country where people speak hundreds of languages, translation enables words and thoughts to travel through time and geographical boundaries. With the aim to synergize languages and give voice to women writers and their thoughts across nook and corner of the country, Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Zubaan jointly launched Prabha Khaitan Foundation Zubaan Translation Program on May 6, 2022 at this India International Center. The formal announcement of Prabha Khaitan Foundation Zubaan Translation Series was done in the presence of few Ehsaas women of India, translators, publishers, authors, and Zubaan personnel. Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Zubaan's joint initiative Translation Series is aimed at bringing feminist literature into Indian languages. The joint collaboration is focused at empowering and improving the lives of women and to bolster the growth and prominence of several other small feminist publishing houses across the country. This far, we have published 35 books in 10 Indian languages. While delving deeper into the translated books genre, and there are few questions that we wish to get addressed. What does it mean to translate into and from Indian languages? Why do we need translation at all? How do we translate and how do the translation perform in the market, etc., etc. To get a deeper understanding today, we have Ms. Ashia Sattar, writer, translator, founder and co-director Sangam House, and Ms. Rita Kothari, writer, translator and co-director of Ashoka Center for Translation. I welcome both of you here in this session. Please, Ashia ji. In conversation with them, we have none other than our very own Urvashi ji, whose experience and knowledge in the field of publishing goes a long way. Without much ado, let me invite Urvashi ji and please start the conversation.
Thanks, Anindita. I'm going to first ask my colleague Manisha Chaudhary, who handles the Prabha Khaitan Zubaan Translation Program for us, to come up and introduce the program and introduce the program again after Anindita Janso and the speakers.
Namaskar, good evening. I'm going to use the mic, since I'm in front of it, to tell you a few more things about how this evening is the beginning of many conversations around translation. And just to give context to that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we have done in the translation program that we actually started in 2021. And as Anindita has already mentioned, it is to support various things. But I think the twin pillars that the program rests on is that it hopes to positively impact the whole ecosystem of translations, because translators until now in the world of publishing have been somewhat ignored, especially when you compare them to many other creators, and they haven't actually been paid as well, and very often they've had to struggle for credit. So I think one of the pillars of the program is that translation gets its due, translators get their due in terms of money as well as recognition. And the second pillar that the program rests on, which Anindita has already underlined, is how women authors and feminist writing, largely published by Zubaan, go into many Indian languages and find new readers. And the response until now has been very gratifying. And we've had the privilege of working with small independent publishers such as Rethink, who are here, and Kavi Prakashana in Kannada, to just name a couple. And we've also worked with some large, well-established ones, such as Mehta Publishing House in Marathi, DC Books in Malayalam, and so on. And we worked in 8 languages: Marathi, Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi, Bangla, and Punjabi in the first year. And in year 2, we were able to add Odia and Konkani to that list. Just to share some tiny highlights which will give you a sense of how this program is actually working and how it is hopefully impacting the ecosystem positively. We have a Tamil publisher called Panmuga Medai, which has chosen the entire Northeast list of Zubaan to translate into Tamil. And he's published around 500 copies of each of the books that he's translating. And he gives me to understand that, they're selling reasonably well, but it's actually caused a lot of interest amongst the scholars in Tamil Nadu. Insight Publica has chosen one of Zubaan's young adult titles and translated it into Malayalam, and 80% of the first print run is already sold. Kavi Prakashana, which is a small independent Kannada publisher run by women, has taken, we also made history, women in the Ambedkarite movement, and more than 300 copies were sold very soon after the release event, which was widely covered in the Kannada press. We also find that we are learning a lot about different languages while we are working in the program. The whole language landscape of India is so varied and so variegated that none of us can actually claim that we know everything about it. But through the running of this program, we are learning interesting new things all the time. For example, we had a pretty tough time finalizing the Konkani publisher who had expressed an interest in the program. And we found, we found out that spoken Konkani and written Konkani are very different. Because published Konkani uses a lot of words and expressions which are pure and shuddh, and our publisher wanted to find a translator who would be willing to use language which was closer to how people speak. Now, it will be interesting to see how that translation fares with Konkani readers, because it's still in the process of it. But things like this is what sort of gives us impetus to keep engaging with different languages and different publishing houses. And this is probably the first of a series of discussions and talks that we are planning to have around translation, and especially feminist translation, and related areas.
You want water?
So I'm going to now again crave your attention for a moment, because I want to give more longer and sort of more, what shall we say, weighty introductions to the people on the dais. So Arshia Sattar has a PhD in South Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. She works with myth, epic, and Sanskrit story translations of the Indian subcontinent and has translated the Valmiki Ramayana and selections from the Katha Sarit Sagar. She runs the YALI program for translation in and out of Indian languages at Sangam House. Rita Kothari is a multilingual scholar and translator whose work spans different disciplines such as literature, cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, and history. Her questions emerge from observations of regions and communities in the western part of the Indian subcontinent, Gujarat, Kutch, and Sindh. Rita has also translated 2 of Zubaan's titles from Gujarati to English: Ila Arab Mehta's novel Fence and Speech and Silence, Literary Journeys by Gujarati Women, an anthology of Gujarati women's writing. Urvashi, of course, needs no introduction. As they say in Urdu, कि किसी तारुफ की मोहताज नहीं हैं आप. And but nonetheless, I will just mention her myriad achievements and say she's an author, teacher, publisher, feminist scholar, and activist, and above all, a dear friend of many of us people in the room. And एक और राज की बात है कि तीनों लोग जो मंच पे बैठे हैं ये अच्छे दोस्त हैं, और लोग कहते हैं कि जो अक्लमंद औरतें साथ बैठती हैं तो कुछ नया ही सीखने को मिलता है. तो handing over to you.
Thanks so much, Manisha. Hi everyone, thank you, and I'm Sanandita. Thanks to the Prabha Khaitan Foundation for actually indulging us with this dream of ours to take feminist content into Indian languages and to see what happens when this little revolution starts unrolling also. Not to say there isn't already feminist content in Indian languages, there is plenty of it, But translations from English into Indian languages are a different thing, and that's what we've been doing through this program, which is now in its third year, and which we hope will continue. And thank you for being here in the rain. It's amazing that you have made it in the rain, and also that you have not succumbed to the temptation to listen to Amitav Ghosh in the neighborhood, where one of our audience members found herself accidentally. She had the chai and then she came here. So thank you very much. You know, I want to add one thing to what Manisha said about this translation program. Something that it has opened up for us, which we didn't also expect at all, although we should have expected it. And that is that the English publishing so dominates the market, and English writing so dominates the market, that it came as a surprise to us when we started, with the help of the PK Foundation, to make small grants or modest grants available for translation. It came as a real surprise to see the amazing, vibrant ecosystem of language publishing that existed all around the country, and also language publishing, not merely the big publishers. There are big publishers like DC Books and like Mehta and Rajkamal and Vani and others, but small independent publishers running publishing houses because they passionately believe in the subject, dedicating their lives to publishing, doing a job on the side to earn money, and so on. And it's also shown us how, when you have a book in a different language, the kinds of journeys it makes can also be very different. As Manisha mentioned, one of the books that we've had a lot of interest in is a book that was originally in Marathi, and we published it in English, and it's about women in the Ambedkarite movement in Maharashtra. It was written by two really well-known Dalit writers, Urmila Pawar and Meenakshi Moon. And then what happened was, we got interest in this book from Kannada, from Telugu, from Tamil. And first we went through this whole thing of, you know, this is a translation already. Should you be translating from a translation? It's impure. What will happen, etc. Then we thought, actually, forget all that. People are interested in the book, and this is one way they are going to get it. And so we said yes to it, and then this book kind of took off. And just the other day, I heard from the Telugu publisher, who had done 500 copies of the book, that her edition was doing quite well, and that she had been approached by an Ambedkarite group who said to her that we would love to have this book for our members, and if we can publish it with you in some way, we will be able to give, not sell, but give 3,000 copies to our members. And that was pretty amazing, because it would never have happened if the book had not been in Telugu translation. So we might argue till we're blue in the face that it was not exactly a translation from the source language to a new language, but the book has traveled. So that kind of thing has been very, very interesting and very surprising for us. And I think there's going to be many more learnings. So I'll move straight to this evening's program, which is with our two wonderful speakers, and thank you both for being here. Rita actually lives part of the time in Delhi and part of the time in Ahmedabad when she's not teaching at Ashoka. She's at home in Ahmedabad, but she came especially in her holiday for us to be part of this program. And Arshia lives in Bangalore, but was in Pune with some precious time with her mother, and she came especially for us to be part of this program. So thank you both very much. I'm really pleased to have you here. I want to start by talking a little bit about, we've called this program Translation as Exploration. And we did that for a reason, because really the act of translation is never merely the mere act of translation, never just traveling between languages from one language to another, never just the words on a page, but it involves so much more. And in your work, both of you, you see that the great scope of where translation leads you and what it involves. Arshiya's work is mainly translating the classics. So she's traveling through language, through time, through space, through culture into another language, and translating texts which are really so well known because they've been orally transmitted that, you know, the differences and the controversies and the arguments are there inbuilt into the very act of taking that kind of decision. Rita's work is different and she makes different kinds of choices, but she's also been very interested in and has recently done a rather wonderful book on translation, which defines translation as an act of unease, an uneasy act, never a simple act where once you've taken a work from one language to another, it's done and finished, but poses questions about whether that other language into which you're taking that work is at all equal to the experience of living in the language from which it is taking it, and are there silences around that experience, are there exclusions in that experience which actually cannot be taken, not only because the language is incapable of holding them, but also because in their own languages they remain unspoken. So for example, even the way women live their lives and in the silences in which they live, how do you actually carry those from one to the other? So after this longish introduction, I promise you I will not speak too much. I love their work, so I could be talking about it at length. I'm going to ask you both to start with one question, which is really, what does translation mean to you? How did you come to translation? How did translation come to you? And maybe somewhere the question of not only how, but where. Meaning where, at what stage in your life. So start by talking about what it means to you. So Arshiya, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, thank you, Rishi, for inviting both of us, and thank you also, Prabha Khaitan Foundation, not simply for making a series like this possible, but also for enabling a gathering like this. It's very, very fulfilling to see so many women in a room. Gentlemen, I have got nothing against you, but I see a lot of you, especially at IIC. Have you noticed how many men there are? I mean, staff upwards. So just being in a room full of women is very energizing. So how did I come to translation? Well, when I was much younger, when I was a teenager, I decided that I wanted to be a translator for the UN because it seemed so posh. Failed miserably. I didn't even try. And then I came to translation as a graduate student in the US, where the degree that I was taking demanded that we learn a classical language, but we also use modern Indian language. And I came to translation because if you're going to write about a text, you have to read it in its original. And I was very, very lucky. I worked with Wendy Doniger and A.K. Ramanujan, who were both on my dissertation committee. And Ramanujan said to me one day, he said, "Why don't you translate?" And I went running to Wendy and I said, "He thinks I'm an idiot. He thinks I can only be a translator. I'm not smart enough to be a scholar." And Wendy just looked at me and she said, "Listen to what you just said and think how incorrect," she used a much stronger word, but I won't use it, "your perspective is." So, and now I find nothing makes me happier than translation. If I'm translating, I can sit for hours at a desk and not even know. In her writing, Zubaan, of course, needs, who can say enough about Zubaan and the women that hold it together. So for me now, especially in these fraught times, not simply in our own country, but all over the world, I think the importance of translation is really political. And I I would urge us all to see it as that. And whatever you receive it for pleasure. Of course, there's great pleasure in reading from other places and other times, but do not forget the politics that underpins this enterprise.
Thank you. Rita? You know, after listening to Arshia and thinking A.K. Ramanujan says to her, why don't you translate? I don't know what the hell to say. I mean, I'm like thinking, this is a man I worshipped all my life. Probably the only scholar whose death meant, you know, something I mourned. And he asked you to become a translator.
कोई बात नहीं, jealousy नहीं होनी चाहिए.
हाँ, jealousy नहीं है यार, मतलब दर्द हो रहा है कुछ यार, jealousy थोड़ी ना है. अर्शिया तो इतनी प्यारी है, jealousy का कहाँ सवाल है. But coming back to your question, the question is, when did I think that what I was doing is actually translation? That is the question. I remember watching this, you know, there's a dialogue from this film called Superman of Malegaon. So you've got these small town where people are making a film, they are creating their own superhero, and the superhero ki badi chaddi hai, choti kar rahe hain, they are trying to do some kind of simulation act and so on. And then someone says that, acha, you do your own editing. And then this man says, acha, humko pata nahi tha ki isko editing kehte hain, hum to puri zindagi kar rahe the ye. So in some sense, I think when you are from a minority language like I am, you know, a language which is increasingly becoming exotic, Sindhi language. I interview now 75-year-old people and they tell me we don't speak Sindhi. And I'm thinking now, you know, what is left now? So when you are from a minority language and then you will learn the language of the state, which is, you know, it's a bit like a Tudu speaker will know Kannada. Yeah, you know. So one would know Gujarati, then one would know Hindi, obviously, so on and so forth. And then I was in Pune, finishing my MA, not wanting to go back to the terrible home I came from. And I thought, I don't want to go back. I need to find a job. I don't have money. I had an interview at Garware College in Pune. And they said, you know, will you teach in Marathi? And I said, yes, I'll teach in Marathi. You know, I just thought, I was like such a hustler. I thought, ye bhi seekh lungi. You know, one has to do it for survival. I don't want to go back home. And a friend of mine said that, you know, Reeds, you just know so many languages, you should do translation. And I thought, acha, like what? You mean it is like a profession? I didn't know what it was. And that is how the journey began. Then I came back to Ahmedabad and then I sort of registered for an MPhil and a PhD. There was nobody to teach it. There was absolutely nobody to teach it. There was some professor of linguistics who used to do like some 1970s linguistics and so on. And he had no interest, but I just needed somebody on paper. And that is how I actually began. And for the longest time, there was actually no, I think I have seen in my own lifetime, in these 25, 30 years, the discipline of translation, the dignity around it, the academia around it, the production around it, the conversations and so forth. And I think today what we heard about the Prabha Khaitan Foundation endeavor, the collaboration with Zubaan, I think this is a big shift. This is where the big story lies. It's so ahead of the curve, which Zubaan always has been, which is that I think from almost a non-existence, if you like, of a translation, sort of a department, activity, you know, a recognition, any of that. From that, then a whole period comes when there is almost an explosion, a profusion of translation from Indian languages into English. In fact, that is how Urvashi and I met, because I was interviewing publishers when I saw this profusion in my book called Translating India. And that is on a rainy day like this, I came to interview her and asking, where is this likely to go? And then here we are today, where it has taken this another very, very interesting turn, which is that we are saying that what gets published in English, what gets published, I'm not saying what gets translated, what gets published in English is leaving us all somewhat tired. It is an over-rehearsed, over-repetitive, and very often a slightly mediocre field. What is happening of interest lies in other languages, but what is also of interest now is to see this sort of dialectic of what appeared to us to be these shadowed narratives in the regions. But people know that interesting politics and most interesting intellectual inputs are also coming from the regions. They are not coming from here, they are not coming from Delhi, they are not coming from English-speaking India, they are coming from what many of us have snobbishly called the Mofussil centers of India. And I think translation is a very, very big part of that democracy. It's a very big part of reorienting and reminding us that what we consider knowledge does not have to only look like this, that it can come in different forms. And so in that sense, I think my journey has not been only I don't know, only is a bad word. My journey has not been it has not been restricted to the activity of translation. It has also been a journey about teaching, about thinking through it. Translation is a very, very big part of my pedagogy now. And in some sense, I think those questions are inseparable for me. Because really speaking, not only when you actually translate concepts in class, but also actually when you allow in a classroom these multiple concepts to kind of, to generate a certain kind of tension or dialogue between different concepts, do you then see that what actually the landscape is doing is to actually regenerate a new method of questions for you, you know? Today I was on some committee evaluating curriculum for a new university that's coming up, and they had this very woke syllabus, right? Like caste comma, gender comma, class comma, ye comma, wo सब 5 commas वाले topics. I was thinking, God, if I was a student, just to sign up for that kind of a course, and I would think, Jesus, it's already so tiresome. Like you just want to make sure that we turn out to be but you take one interesting story from a Telugu or Tamil or Northeast, you will realize the inseparability of these questions. You don't need to do this, conscious intersectionality. All you need to do is take a powerful poem, take a powerful story, do it from a region, a sub-region that you haven't heard about, and a whole world opens up, which is not some kind of a cliched, over-rehearsed conversation, but it can be extremely refreshing. So to me, actually, translation, I think, is at the frontier of major intellectual shifts in this world. And therefore, I think what this kind of collaboration, I think, is just absolutely fantastic. But more later. Thank you. So the thing about having friends with you, is that they say nice things about you, and then they say nice things that you want to listen to. So thank you both for actually opening up a whole range of things, and there is so much there to come back to. I'll come back to one point that both of you made about translation being a political act. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little story that I heard the other day in a discussion on a book, which isn't a book of translation in terms of language, but is a book of translation in terms of knowledge and experience, because it's a book about 7 women from a village in UP called Sitapur who get together to write their own lives, and they write in Hindi. And then it is translated by a writer into English and put together in the book. They start with a little story, which I may have got a little wrong, but the essence of it is there. That unke gaon mein na somebody, the researcher comes to the gaon to do the research. But in order to get to the gaon, the researcher has to cross a river. So he hires a boat and a boatman. A researcher is called Pandit. So Pandit is in the boat with the boatman, and he says to the boatman, "Ke tum development ke baare mein jante ho na?" And the boatman says, "Sir, मुझे तो पता नहीं ये क्या चीज़ है." So he said, "Okay, फिर आपकी ज़िंदगी तो अधूरी रह गई, कुछ ना कुछ तो आपको हो ही जाएगा." Then the next thing he asks him is, globalization के बारे में जानते हो ना? So the answer is the same, and he says, "ओहो, आपकी ज़िंदगी तो और भी अधूरी रह गई." Then the boat topples over and starts to sink. They both fall into the water. So the boatman says to him, "आप तैरना तो जानते हो ना?" And he says, "No." So he says, "आपकी ज़िंदगी तो गई." So I thought that was such a lovely story. So who is the Pandit and who is the research? Who is the researcher and who is the researched? I think that was the question, which is just by the way. Both of you talked about the politics of translation. In your lives as translators, both of you have made very different choices of the works that you have chosen to translate. Sometimes, of course, that choice is not a choice you make. It might be that somebody comes to you and says, "Why don't you translate X?" And if you're attracted and you like it, then you do it. But sometimes they're choices you make. Arshia, you have chosen to translate the classics, and you've talked in your notes, introductory notes to those two particular books, the Ramayana. I mean, imagine translating the Ramayana, Valmiki's Ramayana. Kisne kaha tha? But, she did it. And the Katha Sarita, right? When you chose to translate those texts, you are also, you are entering a field which is already a minefield because there are many translations, but as you say, that no translation is ever complete and it's not done and dusted because it should be, the same work should be translated every 20, 30, 40, 50 years because time changes, language changes, context changes, all of those things. But you also talk about translating a time, that is not only the language, but the context of that moment in time and bringing it into the context of today and questioning whether that language is appropriate to that context. And how do you therefore do time travel and language travel and all of that. So why did you make those choices? Did you know before you made them that this is the minefield it would lead you into? And then I'll ask you the same question, but in a different way, once Arshia has answered.
Yeah. So Ramayana is nearly 30 years old now. So I did it in my mid-30s. And I'd done Katha Sarita before that, which, as you said in our notes, is a very different kettle of fish from Ramayana. And I think it's only because I was young enough in my 30s and because I was such a complete outsider to Ramayana. Of course, I never thought of myself as that because I grew up in many parts of the country, including in Delhi. And when we lived in Delhi, my ayah, who looked after me, Roshni, she would tell me stories at night when I went to bed. And of course, she would tell me Ramayana stories. And my first memory of fear is that Ravana would come and take me away because, of course, I was Sita, right? So I never imagined that I was an outsider to the Ramayana. My mother tells me I was bitten by a monkey when I was 3 years old, right? So later, when, I got interested in Hanuman and this and that, she said, what are you so surprised about? You should tell everybody, Hanuman met you when you were 3. So we utha ke le gaya, So, but I imagined that this was, Ramayana was entirely a part of my culture and that I had a complete and inalienable right to it. Had I known that, of course, that is not the case and never will be the case, I would not have started Ramayana, ever. And also the Rubicon, in a sense, that I had to cross when I was translating Ramayana. And this is not simply to do with overt language, but it's got also to do with covert language. And again, ideologies and politics and all like that. How was I going to translate Sita? What was I going to do with a male character who had behaviors that, as a younger feminist, I obviously found very, very difficult to handle. But what became easy to do was to say, this is not me, this is Valmiki. Yeah. And now that I am reading more and more other Ramayanas, contemporary Ramayanas, of course, when you study Valmiki, you can't study Valmiki, you have to do Manas, you have to do Krittivasa, you have to do Kamban, it's your job. And it's also your pleasure to do that. But now when I think about these other Ramayanas, Valmiki is actually the most radical. Because he gives Sita the chance to say, I've had enough, thank you, I am leaving. Other people, they're very sweaty about it. Kamban is like, I can't tell you what happened after this, it breaks my heart. Right? Rajaji also, Rajagopalachari also said, I can't tell you anymore, poor Sita and how the women in our country suffer. So I'll stop with the Pattabhishekam, with the coronation. Tulsidas in Manas, he turns Sita into a Chayat Sita, right? So nobody actually deals with Sita as a woman who is making choices. So 30 years after being anxious about Valmiki's politics, I'm actually beginning to appreciate them very, very much. That's a surprise. So there's so many languages when we translate. It's the Sanskrit is actually the easiest part of it because you can find somewhere. You'll find a word. And if you don't find a meaning for the word, you just leave it, no? Like I don't translate the word dharma when I translate Ramayana. I'm like, I don't know what this means. I am not giving you a single word translation of this big, big concept. And you have 700 pages to figure out what dharma means. Because you know what? What is the story of the Ramayana? It's Rama trying to figure out what dharma is. So be with him, figure it out on your own. So in that sense, language to language is manageable. It's all the other stuff, like you spoke so eloquently about the silences in which language exists, or the silences within which texts are written. Those are the things that we need to carry across, and all that stuff is never actually about the text that you're working on, right? You cannot translate Ramayana if you don't know Mahabharata. You cannot translate Mahabharata if you don't know Bhagavata Purana. Yeah, stuff like that. So that I think again is very unique to each translator. It's what we choose to bring with us from this larger context. So it's not our physical voice that you're hearing when we translate, but it is a larger ideological voice that we're carrying with us. Yeah.
Let me add a question to that, because these two texts, as you yourself have pointed out, are so very different, and your own tone as a translator in those texts is also very different. Yeah? So, as I said to you when we were having a conversation, the Katha Sagar is kind of funny, joyful, mischievous, exuberant, and the translator looks like she's enjoying herself.
She was. Yeah.
And Ram's story is like compassionate, but a bit distant. Like you want to say, yeah, this guy's okay, but.
Yeah. But I think Valmiki is doing the same thing. Valmiki is not very involved. And again, why is Rama still so compelling? Because we don't know what he's thinking. We don't know what he's feeling. There is a distance from him. So as a translator, I think I'm going to take that as the most amazing compliment I've ever received, actually. That there is a distance in the Ramayana translation. And I think that is really because I'm listening to the voice of Valmiki. For Katha Sagar, bunches of people writing delightful adventure stories. So I'm hearing them, and the fact that I can bring that to the English, I would regard as a major accomplishment. But there is a distance even in Valmiki's writing of Rama.
Okay. Well, a compliment was meant, so you can take it as that. Okay, Rita, so let me ask you about your translation choices, which are eclectic, more eclectic than Arshiya's choices. How did you come to those choices? And one of the questions that actually fascinates me about your work and thinking of translation in the context of what you say is when you talk of not quite the incompleteness, but the unfinishedness of translations. That you do the translation, the work is complete, the book is published, etc., etc. But there is a haunting that kind of stays with you of all the things that somehow got left out. Or not, I mean, that's putting it too literally, but you know what I'm talking about. The echoes of all the voices that inhabit that that work. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I found that really poetic, the way you talked about it. Let me hear it in your own words.
Actually, echoes is a good word. In fact, I don't want to say loss right now. I don't want to say gain right now. But there are hauntings that some things leave us with. The other day I had to redo a paper that I'm doing for another book, and I was reminded of a story, Urvashi, that appeared in the book you published, Speech and Silence, right? And it's not really the most what shall I say, it's not a literary gem or anything like that, but it has haunted me. And it came back to inhabit that paper at the beginning. And it's a story of this, again, it's a Vaishnav, Hindu, Vaishnav, Gujarati household. The mother-in-law is sitting on a swing. A lot of Guju homes have this jhula, no? She's sitting on the swing. The daughter-in-law is constantly finishing all the jobs at home. The mother-in-law sits with the grandchild. She tells the grandchild a story about, Ghangli Ghanchan, a silly, idiotic girl who could never do one job right. And the silly, idiotic Ghangli Ghanchan would, if you ask her to bring doodh, she would bring chaach. If you ask her to bring chaach, she would do this. It becomes like an example of, like a story after story that a grandmother says to the grandchild. The bahu is finishing all the chores in the house, and she thinks she's that Ghangli Ghanchan, right? She's that stupid woman. And the word that this Ghanchan, obviously I can't translate or anything like that. I don't intend to, as if Arshiya can't do dharma, I can't do Ghanchan either. But the point is also that it's a story that must have haunted me, because somewhere deep down it must have reminded me of not a story, but a real life experience from my own family, of how my sister was sent back by her in-laws and they said chariya. Chariya in Sindhi means wo pagal hai. And it is a word that I have grown up being used for women who can't make rotis, women who can't do some housework right, women who can't do this, who can't do that. And you just say it like that. You say chariya. Acha, what chari? You don't say it for men. You don't say chario, you say chariya. And it is said all the time. And somewhere that chari and that ghanchan collapsed in my head to make even this story, which as I said earlier, I'm not saying it is an earth-shattering story or something. I mean, this woman, she just becomes this slightly sheepish, giggly person. She does not become some heart-rending victim. Very ordinary things happen to her. To suck somebody's confidence out of somebody is an ordinary thing. It happens to women all the time, every day. Some confidence is sucked out of her so that it's her daughter's wedding and she ends up going and buying a doormat, thinking, jab jamai ghar aayega to ghar saaf dikhna chahiye, there should be a good doormat. She doesn't end up buying her sari. She doesn't look like a bichari. She just looks sheepish and giggly because she's a chari. She's a ghanchan. She's a Ghangli Ghanchan. That is what all that has done to her, right? These talk that has happened through the day. For me, Urvashi, the choices I make are so often actually about what reminded me of what made me go to what. It is never about one discrete decision. It is certainly not strategy. In fact, if I was strategic, I should have sort of said, I only do this, then it could have built into some other kind of expertise. Very often, it is just so all over the place. Because really speaking, sometimes something else has triggered, there is an impulse, and then you think, well, this story has not been told. This side of Gujarat is not known to people. You know, people have read about, people know this about Munshi, but maybe they need to know how did Munshi become such common sense. They need to read his fiction, right? So then I end up going to Munshi, because I think it is his stories that created a certain kind of asmita of Gujarat. It is not some social science concept. It is a story. It is a narrative. That is how I go to Munshi. So what appears like an eclectic choice is actually this, that I'm just sort of...
It's a journey.
It's a journey. It's a journey, and I'm going sometimes Teda Meda and so on. Sangam House residency that I had, you know, the one that Arshia runs, I was translating Hamid Qureshi, a judge, High Court judge in Ahmedabad, whose house was burnt down in 1969. And he wrote about his experience of those 3 days when his house is burnt down. This is 1969, guys. This is not 2002. It is so similar, I cannot tell you. Even now, people don't understand that we had 2002 because we had 69. It is in 69, when it was a Congress government, that Hamid Qureshi calls up the Chief Minister Hitubhai Desai and saying that, can you send some help? And Hitubhai does not send any help. Right? Try and remember what happened in 2002. So sometimes I'm also doing it because I'm also an academic, right? I'm also thinking of these questions. I'm thinking of history. I'm thinking of temporality. I'm thinking of what people, social scientists very often ignore by not reading the narratives. And then very often, therefore, I am taking that little journey there and saying, okay, let me remind, because how do I have that conversation if that book is not available for you to read? Today, I can talk to you about Hamid Qureshi because now an English translation exists and you can go and take a look at it and see what is happening. So I think very often there's also this कि किसी एक किताब से एक महफिल थोड़ी और खुलती है, फिर नई किताब से फिर थोड़ी और खुलती है, फिर कहीं कोई सिरा खुल जाता है, and you therefore you think कि चलो बातचीत बढ़ेगी, कहीं यहाँ होगी, कहीं वहाँ होगी. So that is what it is. And sometimes then it's also doing something, sometimes when I'm like right now I'm grappling with a paper where I'm thinking, and I was talking to Raza also about this, that what we see as communalism, like Hindu-Muslim tension or whatever, very often is informed by castes. And we don't think about it. And I'm saying this entirely on the basis of actually acts of translation. It is in the process of translating that I'm thinking that, okay, in Ila Arab Mehta's novel, which you published again, you've got a Muslim character who goes to drop something off to someone else's house, and the Hindu girl says, "Acha, tum baramde tak andar mat aana." And she says, she's like puzzled, and she says, "Nana, mara ba keh che ki tu abhadai jaishu." Abhadai jau is to be polluted. And she says, "Mara ba ke je abhadai jaishu." And this girl, Fatima, is thinking, "Abhadai jau etle shu?" She's puzzled. She hasn't heard that before. What is this notion of being polluted? How was this Muslim girl to know? And what does that tell us? And yet we think of the novel as a novel about a Hindu-Muslim relationship. We don't realize that it is also a novel about the pollution that made certain kinds of intimacies rupture, right? It is an insight that comes to me through translation, but Urvashi, didn't happen when I was translating then, which is why I talk about the afterwards of translation, what happens after. This is an insight that occurs to me now, 10 years later. Maybe मुझे ट्यूबलाइट है, थोड़ी लेट बत्ती होती है चीज़ों की, but I think I'm thankful to translation for not letting me finish that job once and for all. For in some sense, I'm thankful to it for actually reminding me a few years later that you think we are very smart. It didn't occur to you then. It occurs to me now. And I'm so glad that learning makes me feel that there is so much more here than I thought.
Can I respond to that? Yes. The afterwards of translation. Translations need to settle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just in the world and with the readers, but we as translators we need to settle, because when we're actually involved in the process of translating, it is so narrow, it is so focused, right? So उसके बाद जब सांस लेते हैं ना, कभी-कभी 10 साल लगते हैं सांस लेने में, and then you say, oh my God, this is what it was. So this is really embarrassing, but I actually teach from my own translation of Ramayana. But honestly, I see things there now that I'm like, hey, did I subconsciously know this at the time, or did I? Is it now? So it's like sand, you know. And it's very. I mean, I love when that happens, because it's settled, and then your mind opens to something else. Otherwise, the sand is still in your head, you know, and you can't really see what next to do. So
In fact, Rita, I was thinking that I was going to ask you about Fence, Ilara Mehta's novel that we published, because I don't remember when it was published, but I do remember that the entire mahal in which the translation came about was a mahal of polarized Hindu-Muslim relations really. And you were very troubled by what you saw as somehow the author's deep conservatism, and you kept saying, "Ispe bada gussa aa raha hai author pe," you know. And then later that, abhi bhi aata hai, par thoda sa badal gaya tha. Okay, so there is, I mean, apart from this response, do you two want to ask questions to each other? I'm monopolizing the conversation. Okay, well, there is such a lot here. I am going to ask Rita and Arshia one other question. And then in case if you wanted to ask anything, my other question is really both of you run organizations, institutions that focus on translation. You do the Sangam House Residency, and Yali and Rita, you're part of the Ashoka Center for Translation. So could you talk a little bit about the role of institutions or organizations in doing this? I mean, I see around us now, as Rita was saying, translation as a new frontier, many similar initiatives. I mean, there is the Tamil Nadu Textbook Board, Textbook Corporation or something, which is pushing for translations of Tamil books into different languages and subsidizing them to some extent. There is the government of Tamil Nadu, which is pushing for translations of Tamil books into all the southern languages and the international languages and various others. These are kind of state initiatives, but there are also the private initiatives like yours, like ours with Prabha Khaitan Foundation, like yours in the university. Can you talk a little bit about what the work you do and how you think it strengthens translation, the activity of translation as a whole? And then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah. So, as you said right at the very start, one of the things that the Yali program, what we do in the Yali program is we try to mentor younger translators, because look at us, I mean, there's a lot of gray hair on this table, right? And we are very good at what we do, but it's also important that we don't dive in like all our secrets. I'm being a bit silly, but I think it is very important to constantly seed new generations of translators, writers, feminists, whatever, all of these things. So we put together, we try to take a younger translator, maybe even somebody who's never translated before, who just cares enough to do it, and we give them 2 language mentors. So somebody who is a native in the original language, so the younger translator can be sure that they're understanding the original language really well, and then somebody who works with them in the target language, so we know that that is accurate as well. And we have as much as we can to get these translations published by smaller Indian language presses, right? And as you said, it's so vibrant. There are so many, and we just don't know this because we're sitting in our little English castle, completely unaware of young people. I mean, people who work full time so that they can publish 6 books a year. Yeah, that kind. So we support those kinds of translations in that we give the press a translation that is ready to go. So that's how Yali works. And we meet once a year as we're getting to the final draft of a work. So the mentors and the translators can actually sit together. And Nita has been with us, Rahul has been with us, Urvashi. I mean, this is fantastic. So many people in this room are involved with Yali. And in 2017 to around 6 years, we've actually made 12 translations that have been published in 8 languages. Please, I would like a little tali for that. Yeah. Because we are not an institution, we are not the government, we're a bunch of extremely dedicated people who believe that why would you not want to know what is happening in somebody else's head, in their language, in their culture, in their dreams? That is why you need to translate, right? So Yali works in very, very small ways. But I think very, very effective ways, because what we are actually building is a network that we are mutually so committed and indebted to each other, that we're always going to go the extra mile for a Yali book or a Yali translator or something like. I'm a little leery of large institutions. The state I stay away from completely, and that, that's we all have different ideas about our relationship with the state, institutionally, individually, and whatever. I choose not to have one. But I'm a little bit worried about institutions because they're so big and they're so top-heavy. And one of the things we realized with Yali, this well, Urvashi, the smaller we became, the more work we were able to do. We became so light and so agile. And so it's like, okay, this is coming, chalo. पर कमिटी होती है, फिर इसका सैंक्शन लेना पड़ता है, फिर उसके ट्रिप्लिकेट में ये लिखना पड़ता है, फिर उसका रिकमेंडेशन आना है. Not that we don't do that.
500 कॉपी ले लेते हैं ना, तो ठीक है.
वो भी तो होता है. Yeah. So and we're also very, very lucky that we have a dedicated funder. We have one single donor who supports Yali. So yeah, it's working for us. It's working for us. And the other thing that I've lived in the South now for 30 years. So half my life I've lived in the South. And when I'm in the South, I feel like a North Indian. When I come to Delhi, I feel like a South Indian, right? But it is so clear to me. It is so clear to me that Delhi does not look beyond its nose. There is a country out there. Yeah, there is an entire subcontinent. There are languages, there are cultures, there are subcultures, there are dialects. Yeah, and I am very, very happy that most of our work is actually been in southern languages. And I don't know if that sounds patronizing. I don't mean it to sound patronizing, but I'm really sick of Hindi, Bangla, these dominant languages which have big translators and big money and big presses behind them. Yeah, it's nice to be doing something in Konkani or in Tulu or in Telugu or, yeah, I'll stop. That's the end of my rant.
Or in Punjabi.
Or in Punjabi, quite, exactly.
Rita. About the same
yeah, I think I have flirted with centers even before. When Katha used to be a very active organization, I used to run at St. Xavier's College a Katha Center for Translation, where I would actually bring students, make students who came from tribal regions of Gujarat to bring their stories. We would sit together, document them, translate them. So I mean, even with very little money or hardly any funding, there was. So what that did for me was that I knew that there is always a kind of there are always some students who want to do this, but who have not found the time, the moment, the place for it. And you only have to sometimes just kind of allow that a little bit through talks, through this, through that. And to do that at Ashoka meant to actually have that belief in a constituency where you couldn't immediately see the evidence of it. But the moment I began to see evidence of it, and Arunva and I were coming from two different sides. I do slightly less sort of dominant languages and so forth. And also I write a lot about translation history and politics and so on. But both of us felt from our different spots that there was a lot of interest, right? And so actually that is the big thing here, which is that we are beginning to see students who have hitherto, and this is not only Bangla, of course that will still dominate, but also other students who have not thought about their Bhojpuri, not only not thought of it, who perhaps had an awkward relationship with their Bhojpuri or their Maithili, and now they know that there is a place here where they'll come up to you and say, you know, I think I want to do something, right? And that to me was in some sense a much more profound thing. It is not only about language. By owning up that side to you, what you are also saying is that I am not taking some cut and paste metropolitan education. I'm an individual here. I'm intervening in it. And I will intervene. Yeah, I will intervene in ways that it makes it more agential, right? So that you're not part of some cookie cutting sort of a culture. And that is how the Ashoka Center for Translation began. And we've managed to bring out few books that our students have translated. And then we also have a tie-up we have a project on women translating women, which we are doing with Urvashi, and many other things that we are doing. We are coming out with a book where there are shloks of Kabir in 8 languages, including things like Persian and Sindhi. Yeah. And it's being led by my colleague Sanchit. He's going to be editing it. So I think there is we now use the word multilingual a lot, and nobody says, really speaking, it's not as if we have suddenly become one, and it's not even as if we weren't one earlier, but we didn't need to display it so much. Like, we don't say things like bahubhashiyata. Bharat bahut bahubhashiya desh hai. Nobody talks like that. Because है भाई, ये और क्या होगा, मतलब ऐसे ही होता है ना? So but I think there are two things happening here, and which is why one shouldn't make any generalizations. At least as teachers we are reminded this. At some point it looks like there are people who barely speak their own language properly. All they have is English, and we know of enough people like that. But then there is also another reality where you also have a lot of people coming from cities where they weren't coming to these institutions, right? Or first generation learners who are bringing those languages. I think you have both, the impetus of both. And I think it is time for people like us, by which I mean the three of us, it is time to see that this is a good time to steer them in which direction. This is a good time to see that, to actually build. I think it's a great time. And there is that hunger. And I think there is an intellectual desire, something, even questions of like sexuality. I think it's just so fascinating in the way people will use some words from English, but there might be some other words. There is a whole landscape there, which is just fascinating to study, read about, think, translate, and think more.
Yeah, I'm so glad you used the word hunger, because that is true, that actually it is a hungry kind of enterprise. And I was thinking as you were both talking that the next time we meet here, maybe we'll be all three working together, the three programs. That should be quite nice, and we could have a celebration of that. So if any of you would like to comment, ask questions, okay, Nilima, and then you.
Both to Arshia and to Rita, since both of you are so skilled in translation, and I assume that being skilled in translation is just automatically means that you're super skilled in the languages in which you're working. If you're translating from one medium into another, you have to be at par in your knowledge and ability and conversant with that language. So my question to you is, which we often tend to do, is when exact translations are not possible. I understand that. That is a challenge which all translators face. The other challenge which I find is that when I am trying to interpret or translate, I'm no translator, but I consider myself bilingual because I'm being reasonably okay in Hindi and English both, is that I tend to impose my interpretation into what the writer may not even have said. So when you are translating, what is the level of purity or what is the level of loyalty that you have to the thought of that writer?
Okay, don't answer yet.
I have one more question. So I'll say it and then you can answer.
Okay.
My second question, which is more relevant today, is that with this looming threat of artificial intelligence, all of this will become redundant. What do you have to say?
वो तो Google Translate ने पहले ही कर दिया था.
Exactly.
है ना?
No, but Google Translation is different from artificial intelligence.
Okay.
There's another level of.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, yeah.
Okay. And we take your question also.
Yeah, I'm Devyani. And my question actually, you both mentioned one word, like you said dharma and you said Kamli Kanchan. And I translate from English to Hindi. And what I was thinking that I can still imagine that dharma can be perceived in English up to a certain extent. But if you don't translate Kanchan, then how does it goes with the language if you are translating in English? And then I think somehow you also asked, and that is a question in my head also, that this struggle of finding the right expression, not for the words only, but the phrases, but the experience that is coming from some very far in the village or any place. So when it comes to, and then when you are translating into a language which is not as much ours, so how do you resolve those conflicts or that dilemma? And then one final is that what do you think about, like, since you have been doing translations for almost 30 years or more probably, so the resources between languages, because if you are translating from Sindhi, so one is that you know the language, but always nobody can claim of knowing the language, either the source or the language in which you are translating. Knowing the language up to length where you don't need help of dictionaries or other sources, and then as Urvashi said about the Google, but that is not a solution. So, and if I don't know if that is available with the regional languages or like languages like Hindi. So, what do you see? How do you think, like in these 30 years, if there is the resources has improved, or we are still and in the same position, or are we hoping for, since if the universities are working on it, this between different languages, the support that a translator requires sometimes to actually understand the exact meaning from the language they are translating and to actually put it in the words in the language that they want to translate. So, what do you think that if there is a change, if there is some more resources available where they are?
There are two more questions.
I have to go. Can I say 2 sentences? It's not a question.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that my best experience of my translation to another Indian language is with Malayalam.
Mm-hmm.
When my Katbula was translated into Malayalam, the first day it was launched, 200 copies sold. And another book, Masuka Kutum, was translated into Malayalam, both by Tanmaya.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a seminar in the Vidhan Sabha.
Mm-hmm.
On it. Okay. Now, my point is they were not translated or published by DC Publications.
That's
But
good,
by
no?
a small publishing house. That's all I did.
Do you want to take the other two? Or?
Yeah, we can actually take all of them and then
Take all of them.
and then maybe Arshia can respond.
Okay. So, yeah, two more. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Proving this talent involving publishing place also. I'm very curious to know that when you translate, who is the audience that you're translating for, and what is the age group and the context that this audience is coming from, according to you? And I'm coming from this question, coming with this question specifically because we focus a lot on children. So I'm also curious to know as to when you translate, and if you were to translate for kids, like let's say till the age of 10, and if you translate for somebody who's about 20, what kind of variations would you see in your own translations there?
Can we just start answering, but now it's all spinning in my head.
Yeah, okay. There's one more, but oh, there's two more. Okay,
many,
then we'll take in the next. Okay, go.
So, I'm very agitated about some of the things that are being said. Okay, first of all, if you're translating, you don't decide an audience. You're presenting the text in another language. Now, Valmiki is written for the 10-year-old and for the 90-year-old. So, I'm not making those choices, but who the audience is. The text, because it already exists, has its own audience. It's not like writing a book like, oh, I'm going to write for children. But I also retell the epics for younger readers. And that's a completely different set of choices because I'm not translating. And this question about listen, I love dictionaries. I love other people's translations. I love people who know the language better than I do. Really, I do. Because I think to imagine that you are the sole arbiter of meaning and significance, I think you would have I would have a problem with a translator who thought of themselves as such, right? So, of course, richer and dominant languages have many, many more resources in terms of even what's on the internet, let alone what's in dictionaries. And look at the work of Anvita Abbi, right? She is working with nothing. She is working with people who know what something means. She's working with the Andaman people, right? Now, how is she going to bring that to the Liwalas? There is no dictionary, that there are only elders. She is translating. That is magnificent, right? So when somebody says, oh, I can't translate because there are no resources, I'll let you go be Anvita Abbi and, just think about it, right? You don't have to be her. And this other thing of how much do I listen to the voice of the text? Of course, I'm constantly listening to the voice of the text, right? But I am still me. And the reason you are reading Arshiya's translation is because you actually trust Arshiya. You have a contract with me, as I have with Valmiki, right? So when people say, "Arey yaar, you're interpreting," and all, "Jao, 10 pad ke aao na." You don't like Arshiya, read Vivek De Broy, read what's his name, Ramesh Menon, read Falana, read Dhimka. Like, actually, you're still not going to get it right. So why don't you just go learn Sanskrit and then you'll get it on the nose, right? So this business of you are interpreting and I am interpreting. No, I am translating. This is not simply my profession, it's my vocation, it is my great passion. I do not take it lightly. And I make every effort I can to bring you as close as the text to the text. And also this other thing, all languages are equal. They're all as rich and as poor as each other. It's like, English is so fantastic, yaar, we can do so many things with it. No, Hindi is also fantastic. Japanese is also fantastic. Korean is also fantastic. Yoruba is also fantastic, right? So this hierarchy of languages and meanings and all, I can't deal with that anymore. I mean, as a younger translator, I say, I can't say these things in public. Now I'm old enough to say them. So, thank
you. Some of you said you've been both translating for 30 years. Some of the questions also we've been listening for 30 years. And I have to say, I think if you would, the respect that needs to be shown to translators should be evident in the questions you ask the translators. That questions should be about, what did that archive mean to you? What did it do for you? Right? What, if you were to ask Arshiya that, do we think Ram is as such a wimp as he appears to be? Or are there sides to him that we didn't know about? Then you are actually approaching a translator as a thinker also, as a scholar, and as someone who's intimate with something. Translation is intimacy. It enriches us, it also does not leave us fully unscathed. We come away from it, slightly damaged, slightly enriched, slightly changed, slightly made porous. Ask us questions about that. I mean, the questions about are there enough dictionaries, are there, I mean, that information is available. This panel is also about actually thinking, why are these women translating? What is it about us as women? Right? Is there a feminist translation? What does gender have to do with translation? Arshia is translating Valmiki. I have translated some awful men. I mean, why are we doing it? What was it like for us to do, for instance, some of the women writers? Was there a manifestation? And now that we are talking of gender as a spectrum, what does that actually mean? What is that engagement about? I mean, it really bothers me that we don't seem to go beyond the empirical questions at all. Are we doing only some kind of a skill here? I thought the entire session was trying to constantly establish that this is also an epistemology, that this is an engagement, that this is knowledge production. So I think those are the questions that, because really speaking, translators are also knowledge makers. They are knowledge disruptors, right? So did I translate Gangli Ghachar? No, I did something, I can't remember, but it was adequate. I think the point is not about whether surely I built something into the story. It's a thoroughly readable story, so it explains it in the context, Devyani, but to answer your question. To answer your question, Nilima, about artificial intelligence, I think we tried actually. We are constantly trying to see Google Translate, we are trying to see other kinds of, some of it is working, some of it is not working. Some of it may actually be a boon, but sometimes some of it will require a lot more work for us to make it better. It's almost like making the commons, contributing to the commons, so that later the commons can help us. But until then, we will have to enrich the vocabulary of AI, right? It's not going to happen like that. So I think it is a little more complicated. But so I think I just wanted, I'm sorry if it sounded blunt, but I just want to say that there is please don't reduce translators and translation to a skill. That is not what it is about. It's about something far more, which is actually a little difficult to describe and capture. Yeah? Translate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. Thank you. We have a few other questions. I have to say, because Rita said this, that I this evening deliberately stayed away from the predictable question that I would have asked, which is the feminist question, and I kept it for the end, but I'm not going to ask it now because we'll have to close soon. But that is the question you both would have expected me to ask, and I would have expected myself to ask, but I wanted to surprise you. And okay, we had 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
So no empirical question, please.
So let's go in that order. 1, that's you, then 2, 3, and 4. And then we'll ask them to answer. Go ahead.
Hi. Whenever I just completed my master's, and whenever I read any feminist text, the first thought that came to my mind was, my mother should read this. And my mother can't possibly read in English at this point, so I thought, why don't I do something about it? Because I want to. And then I was like, it shouldn't possibly just be about my mother, maybe other women from my village also. And other gender minorities that are there in my village. So my question is, as a student myself, what can I possibly do to incorporate the skill of translation as sort of an underground pedagogy for people who can't possibly access this route, for example?
That's quite lovely. I think there can be many ways, right? I mean, our history of scholarship in South Asia shows that commentary, expansion, all these are forms of translation. It doesn't have to be only producing hoo-ba-hoo what's in one language into another. So really speaking, even if you were to summarize something, there can be many ways of doing it. I think what you're basically talking about is a certain kind of a chasm and a certain excitement which you want to share. So there can be, I mean, taflees ho sakti hai na, kai cheezein ho sakti hain, and those should also be explored. Very often I just orally summarize what I'm writing to many members in my family because they can't read, right? So
I'll be very honest. I am a lawyer. I have not really been exposed to this side. I came across a post, seemed really interesting, which is why I'm here, and it's been an amazing evening for me. So which is why my question would not be as enriching as how others have asked. It's actually a very basic question, which Arshia, you had mentioned, which really struck by me, because I have just read a few months back The Palace of Illusions, which was basically the entire story of Mahabharata through Draupadi's point of view. And now I'm reading The Palace of Illusions. I'm reading the story of Sita, basically Ramayana through Sita. So you mentioned that, and this is for the entire panel, you mentioned that somehow Ramayana and Mahabharata are extremely different from each other. Now, the reason why I ask you this is because from a very, I think, a rudimentary point of view, you would think that they talk about something like dharma, they talk about roles and responsibilities of a king, of a queen, and of a brother, of a sister, of a warrior. So, my question to you, everyone on the panel, would be how exactly can we differentiate between the two? And as a translator, where do you feel the difference lies, in your personal opinion?
Sit while you're thinking about it.
Somebody else can answer while I'm thinking about it. I'm very happy that you're reading. Now this is an interpretation. This is a version. This is Devakaruni's. Of what? Why don't you read the translation? Read mine. It's very good. And you see what she's talking about. Right. Now when I do Mahabharata, you can read my Mahabharata also. But I have one for children actually. But that is Ramayana and Mahabharata are similar. They're very different from each other, but they're similar because they come out of the same historical moment, which is a very masculinist moment. It's about the moment when we're moving from Vedic religions and practices to what becomes more and more recognizable to us as Hinduism. It's also the moment of the oligarchies. It's a moment of a lot of political shift. It's a moment where women are treated extremely poorly. So in that sense, they are similar. They're concerned with the same things. But now that you've read both Devakarunis, you know that Mahabharata is way more extreme than Ramayana is. Sita is abducted, Draupadi is stripped naked in public. That just gives you a sense of the difference in the tenor of these two texts. So and it's really up to you to figure out what you think is similar and what you think is different. Don't really read it. It's good stuff. It really, and actually also, like, this is the afterwards of translation. If you read Ramayana and Mahabharata, so much about our lives as contemporary women in India will suddenly become extremely clear, like why this is happening, right? So just read that. It's good. The more you read, the better it is for everyone, for the whole world.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for that interesting discussion and conversation. I was thinking about a couple of things that came up in the conversation. One was the question of both the sort of physical and the ideological mind of text that one has to get into as a translator, and the question of intimacy that you brought up as well. And I'm thinking that, there's the question of perhaps untranslatability, that there's always some word that is difficult to translate, and there's some nuance and you can riddle over it endlessly. But then there's also the unbearable intimacy when you understand exactly perhaps what the author is saying and you don't like what the author is saying as well. And how do you perhaps confront that, and what is the ethics of perhaps navigating that? And I'm curious if, as translators, you ever decided to maybe give up a project because of that as well.
Let's take the other question as well. There's one more question, the last one, and then we can.
Actually, as someone who is probably giving it a thought to enter into the domain of translation, it actually bothers me to find the answer of how does the translator actually distance himself or herself from the author? As ma'am said, that probably while she is translating, she is finding the author probably a bit annoying or not very agreeable to. In those times, what should be the perspective or the point that you will be dealing with?
with the text as a translator?
I think in the early part of the introduction, Urvashi, when she was introducing Arshia, she said, "You're joyful and playful when you do Katha Sarit Sagar, and you are somewhat different." So this whole business about distance, intimacy, I think varies. It depends on the text you are doing. It's not every text does not allow the same intimacy. You don't want that intimacy every time. So it really varies, So I don't think there's a should about this. Coming to your question, Ishan, I think of the one very distinct instance that comes to my mind. I think it is one of the in my CV, if there is one translation that I'm required to justify, is K.M. Munshi, right? He's a slightly dodgy character, but also very interesting. And this trilogy, which every reading public of Gujarat, everybody read it for generations, right? If there's one novelist that everyone from Amit Shah to a 13-year-old has read, it is K.M. Munshi. But there is one novel in that trilogy where I didn't have the hots for this project. I mean, I went into it partly because it was the joy of doing it with my partner, and I thought, what the hell, let's do this. It's huge, I won't do it on my own. In any case, I won't do it. But if you are doing it, let's just do it together. But there was this one instance in one of the three novels of the trilogy where Ranak Devi, who's again a very big character in the mythology of Gujarat and so on, she does Johar, right? And very Padmavat kind of situation. And it was so infuriating, even sort of I refused to do it. I just got up and left, and I said, "This you handle. I mean, you have such romance, no, about this novel, you grew up on it, go do it. I'm not doing it." So I couldn't do that part. Does that mean that I would leave the project? For that one thing I couldn't have. I wouldn't. There was far too much going on. And what was also interesting is that even when sometimes things are dodgy, there is something else which is very surprising. For instance, Arshia was earlier talking about women characters and so on, right, of the Ramayana. Now, one of the actually most assertive women characters, which I don't find in contemporary Gujarati women's writing, which I did for Urvashi, but the character here, the woman Manjari, in this particular novel is very interesting, very assertive, to the extent that she actually quotes her lover and says, "Can't you see that I want you badly, I want to sleep with you?" And this is medieval Gujarat. At least Munshi has situated in medieval Gujarat. So I think life can be full of surprises. People could be dodgy in one quarter of the book, and people could be quite different and surprising in another quarter of the book. You don't take or leave things like that. Once you make a commitment, you see it through, right? It's a bit like living with an annoying relative. We don't leave them and go away. We just don't engage with them, on a WhatsApp.
On something. Okay, I think this is a good note on which to end this evening. Can I ask Manisha and maybe Sanchit, if you could help, if you could bring those books here. We brought the translated books that have been published so far, and it's a good photo op, so we could just hold them up and so you can see. So 10 books have arrived in different translations. Others are on the way. Manisha, tum bhi idhar aa jao and just hold it up. So Sanchit, Rita, Harsha,
कौन सी वाली?
जो भी पकड़ लो. Anindita,
पंजाबी.
And
I'll pick up Punjabi.
Yes, thank you all very much for listening. And
can we stand or no?
Yeah, we can stand. And just hold up the books so that they can be seen. You can hold two each. Manisha, aage aa jao. Wait, now, where, and they're not enough. Oh no, you have to hold one more, Anindita.
One more?
Yeah. And Arshia, have you got one or two?
I have one. No, you have to hold two.
I can hear.
Yes.
Three like तीन पत्ती.
नहीं, तीन पत्ती की जरूरत नहीं. अब हो गया. हाँ, अब हो गया. So this is Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Marathi, Malayalam, yeah, Punjabi, Gurmukhi, हाँ.
both congratulations.
Yeah, really nice, no? Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank
It's great to see you. Thank you, Rita, Dia. This lovely conversation. Thank you, Zubaan team.
Yes.